I'd like to express my deep gratitude for the organizers to invite me to participate in this panel on the important subject of peace and security on Korean Peninsula. After the two earlier sessions on the resolution of North Korean nuclear issues and the China factor in that question, Session 3 will focus mainly on the U.S. ROK coordination on North Korean issues. We have 4 excellent panelists to diagnose the difficult policy, historical, political issues related to North Korea and its role on Korean Peninsula. Let me introduce Professor William Stuke from University of Georgia, Professor Young-Sun Ha from Seoul National University, and Victor Cha from Georgetown University, and also Professor Kang Choi from the Institute for Foreign Affairs and National Security. As in the earlier sessions, each of the panelists will have up to 15 minutes to present their view. And I would like the panelists to be as strict as possible to meet that time limit so that we would have a lively Q&A session after an hour of presentation. With those words, I would like to call upon Professor Stuke for presentation.
Thank you. Well, this has been a wonderful day for me so far, and these panels are all hard acts to follow, but I'll do my best. I must say the last panel did a remarkable job in keeping us all from nodding off after lunch. I've been asked to talk about the kind of historical background of U.S.-South Korean coordination regarding North Korea from the Korean War to around 1994, the first nuclear crisis, and I'll try to stick to that. Since I have so little time to talk about so much, I've tried to organize my talk around a couple of kind of broad concepts. I've stolen one from Victor Cha, abandonment versus entrapment. That is, I will argue that from really even before the Korean War, a big divergence between South Korea and the United States was that the Americans first and foremost feared entrapment in something they didn't want to get into, and the South Koreans feared abandonment. And that basic dichotomy continued really all the way until 1993, 1994, in the first nuclear crisis. And from that time forward, really, the balance between the fears on the two sides has shifted somewhat, and that has had a very significant impact on the relationship. I also want to speak off and on to the matter of process versus substance. And I think, I'm a historian, not a political scientist, so I tend to be, and I'm kind of a centrist, so I see complexity. So when I throw out broad concepts like entrapment versus abandonment and process versus substance, I'm a little bit uneasy because I recognize that there's a good deal of both on both sides, and they overlap. But for the sake of simplicity, I want to use them. Okay, the first era really in the U.S. ROK relationship is 1948 to 1960, what we might call the Rhee period, the Syngman Rhee era. And Syngman Rhee was a remarkably difficult person to deal with. And the relationship between the United States and Rhee had been very rocky in the 1945 to 48 period. The United States was was not, to say the least, terribly happy with his leadership, but saw really, by 1948, really no alternative, any anti-communist alternative to him. But given the rocky nature of the relationship, the United States wanted to be very, very careful not to overcommit itself to him, because one of the things, of course, he wanted to do from day one was march north. And John Muccio, who was our first ambassador there, was very careful. He had control over the granting of military aid, or the dispensing of military aid to the ROC Army. He was very careful never to give them too much, so that he could entertain any serious idea of marching north in a large way. And in fact, the only time in the U.S. relationship with South Korea in which the United States was willing to use military force to try and unite the peninsula was, and of course, the ill-fated campaign after Incheon in September of 1950, which provoked the Chinese Communist intervention. And once the Chinese had intervened full blast in late November, and it was clear that they had intervened full blast, the Americans very quickly moved back to a position of containment. Syngman Rhee never did. And so there was constant tension, especially from the summer of 1951, when the United States, of course, entered into negotiations, armistice negotiations, which lasted for over 2 years, and when they appeared to be on the verge of succeeding in the spring and early summer of 1953, Rhee, of course, tried to prevent them and actually held up an armistice for 6 weeks, and indeed, to this day, the Republic of Korea has not signed the armistice, a point which, of course, the North Koreans are constantly using to try and bypass direct negotiations with South Korea for a peace treaty. Now, despite the tension in the relationship, in the immediate aftermath of the war, the United States concluded a military defense pact with South Korea. In fact, this was one of the conditions that Rhee made to at least temporarily not actively resist the armistice. But Rhee did not get nearly all that he wanted in it. For one thing, he wanted a statement that the ROK's lawful jurisdiction extended, and I quote, throughout the traditional area of Korea and specifically northward to the Yalu and Tumen rivers. The United States obviously declined, refused to go along with this. Number two, Rhee wanted the treaty to stay in effect indefinitely. The United States insisted on an escape clause. Either side could withdraw with 1 year's notice. Number three, Rhee wanted an automatic, and I quote here, effective U.S. military response in the event the ROK was attacked. The United States only agreed that it would act to meet the common danger in accordance with its constitutional processes. Now, there was a private letter that Dulles sent to Rhee in August of 1953 that was somewhat of a halfway between what Rhee wanted and what the United States wanted, but in the actual treaty, to meet the common danger in accordance with its constitutional processes was as far as it went. And of course, that was a distinct difference from the NATO treaty that the United States had signed in 1949. Now, a year and a day after the armistice, July 28, 1954, Rhee was in the United States, and he made an address to a joint session of Congress. It's interesting, I was looking this up because I'd never seen an actual text of it, but what I discovered without much effort is that there's an audio of most of that speech that you can get on YouTube. Just do a simple Google search, and before you get to the end of the first page, you can actually get an audio. And I had never heard Rhee's voice before, but there it is. But it was a very belligerent speech in which, and this was in the aftermath of the Geneva Conference, the better-known part of the Geneva Conference, of course, is on Indochina, but in fact, before the Indochina part of the conference, there was one on Korea, which ended in stalemate. Rhee said, okay, now it's time to end the armistice, and made it very clear, this is a joint session to Congress. that really the armistice should end and we should go about uniting Korea by force. Tremendously embarrassing to Eisenhower. Now, there was nothing wrong with the process leading up to this speech, except maybe that the Americans didn't read it. He wouldn't even, in fact, show that speech to Robert T. Oliver, who was his publicist in the United States and lobbyist and frequent speechwriter. He showed him all the other speeches. In fact, Oliver wrote most of the other speeches that he made in the United States during that visit, but not that particular speech. That was very much Rhee's own. And it's a classic illustration of there's very little you can do to save a situation by process when there's a fundamental disagreement on substance. Indeed, 2 days before that, there was a top-secret meeting between Eisenhower and Rhee and the delegation and, of course, Eisenhower's top advisors, in which Eisenhower made it very, very clear that the United States would not support an initiative to resume the Korean War, but Rhee went ahead anyway. Now, the relationship got a lot better. How much more time? 5 minutes? Okay, I'll move along fast. Under Park Chung-hee, and frankly, this is an overgeneralization in a sense, but you know, Park Chung-hee really deserves to go down in history as Korea's greatest individual, I think, in the 20th century. And he shifted the focus of South Korean policy and strategy from a unification strategy to an economic strategy. Rhee basically ignored economics, and Rhee and Park focused on them, putting unification on the back burner, and basically, in many ways, adopting a magnet idea vis-a-vis the West German model of developing the economy to the point where the East Germans would want to be part of it. And of course, he, in many ways, succeeded with that model. And the high point, in many ways, of the American alliance with South Korea was the 64 to 68 period, when Park had actually shed his military uniform. He'd actually conducted in 63 a fairly free election, which he had won, became a civilian government under American pressure, had effectively pursued economic development, had concluded a normalization with Japan, and then subsequently gone on with the commitment of some 50,000 troops to Vietnam. At a big cost to the United States in terms of economic assistance. Really a brilliant period, I think, in Park's leadership of South Korea. And of course, in many ways, it all came crashing to an end in January of 1968 with the Blue House raid and the Pueblo incident, when the problems or the different agendas of the United States and South Korea came to the fore, because, of course, the United States was deeply embroiled and preoccupied with Vietnam. This was the eve of the Tet Offensive, which began at the end of the month. The Blue House raid occurred a couple of days before the Pueblo incident. But once the Pueblo incident did occur, the American preoccupation was with getting the ship and especially the crew back. And the Americans did, in fact, give priority to that objective. And Park never forgot or forgave. Now, he was very emotional about it. Cy Vance went over there in February and negotiated a bit, and things did calm down. But the relationship was really never the same. And one of the things that particularly stuck in Park's craw was that the United States decided to negotiate directly with North Korea on the issue at Panmunjom, basically ignoring the Blue House raid. So you see the beginnings of a deterioration from that high point in the relationship in 1968. And of course, it continues really pretty much through the 70s. When Nixon gets into office, of course, he withdraws a division of troops against Park's pleadings. There is actually a plan in the Nixon administration to withdraw the remainder of American ground troops and leaving just enough there to protect our air forces and our nuclear weapons. During the Carter administration, of course, there was a more public advocacy by the president to withdraw the troops, and in many ways the peak or the low point of the relationship, which really doesn't begin to recover until the Reagan administration takes over in 1981. And of course, by that time, we have the next military dictator, Chun Doo-hwan, in power. I think if there is a second peak in the relationship between the United States and South Korea in the alliance, it's in the Bush 1 no-Taeyu period. You have here two very competent, experienced people in diplomacy. Bush in a more general sense than no-Taeyu, but no certainly had a lot of contact with the United States. He had an excellent temperament for international politics. And I think there was a good deal of coordination of policy between the two in the transition from Cold War to post-Cold War. There still is some concern on the part of No, despite his initiatives to North Korea and to the Soviet Union and then former Soviet Union and China, there is still some concern about abandonment in the sense that with the end of the Cold War, there's tremendous pressure from the U.S. Congress to reduce our troop presence abroad, and that includes Korea, and in fact, roughly 6,000 troops are withdrawn from South Korea during the Bush administration, and there was certainly an intention to continue consideration of further reductions, and of course what ultimately prevented that was the rise of the nuclear issue. One of the misfortunes in terms of timing of the rise of the nuclear issue is that it occurred at a time, or at least something approaching a nuclear crisis, was it arrived at a time when two new leaders were at the head of their respective governments, Bill Clinton and Kim Young-sam. And although I think Clinton developed a good deal of finesse in dealing with international politics and U.S. relations with South Korea as he got more experience, his initial efforts were rather clumsy. And I think Kim Young-sam really was never terribly comfortable with international politics, and it showed. So you really have a couple of things happening here, some of it over substance, some of it over process. Both of them led somewhat messy regimes, and Kim Young-sam would tend to bend in the wave of public sentiment at home rather than really trying to manage it. He would sometimes take actions, make public statements without any prior consultation with the United States that created great irritation. And he never really quite developed a consistent approach to North Korea. So there were both problems of substance and process here, and I think that the relationship never really gets fully back on track, certainly while Kim Young-sam is in office. But even with the process aside, you have with that nuclear crisis where the United States really does go to the brink of war, with the South Korean people now no longer terribly hungry, and what was it, Mansaroff this morning, they said something about people who are hungry are much more dangerous than people who are not. Well, the South Korean people were much less interested in war now than maybe they would have been in the 1950s, because they had a heck of a lot more to lose. And I think that the crisis conveyed a sense that, hey, the United States may entrap us in a situation, in a conflict, which we very much want to avoid. So from that point onward, we really have somewhat of a shift in the balance of that dichotomy. Okay, I'll finish there.
Thank you, Professor Stuck. The next speaker will be Professor Young-sun Ha.
It is very nice to have a chance to share our views on the North Korean nuclear issues, as most of the important arguments on the North Korea's nuclear issues have already raised quite sufficiently during two previous sessions and also two keynote speeches. I would rather raise 4 major questions in a direct way. First, the evaluation of current North Korea's mixed signals. Second, the future of six-party talk. Third, different definitions of denuclearization and peace regime, including peace treaty. And fourth, the future of the possible solution of the North Korean nuclear issues. To avoid the danger of Orientalism for the discussion of the 4 major issues I raised, I will try to use more extensively North Korean official statement on the 4 questions. Let me start with the first questions on the evaluation of current North Korea's mixed signals. Right after the announcement of North Korea's joint new editorial of 2010, there were some confusing views on the analysis of joint editorial. Most of the North Korean watchers would like to read the editorial in an optimistic perspective because the editorial gave pretty much emphasis on the standard of living of people in comparison with previous editorials. However, as we all know, the current situation goes in a little different way than we expected. When we look at the official statement which was issued during this month of January, so far, after the announcement of joint New Year editorial, there were 2 more official statements from the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the DPRK and another one from the spokesman for the DPRK National Defense Commission statement, January 15th. And we also know there was small fire exchange between South and North and the western coast of the Korean Peninsula. My point is rather clear. There are some continuities and changes in the basic official statement of North Korea during the month of January. It seems to me that we would rather avoid the confusion of the North Korea's use of some specific concepts or words such as enhancement of standard of living of the people. Of course, that kind of words is important for us to analyze the current situation of North Korea, but I would like to propose we should analyze in depth the basic structure of North Korean statement. For instance, in the case of the New Year editorial basically maintained so-called 1-4-1-1 structures, which means that first 1 means that the basic guiding principle of North Korean policies. Next 4 means that the related with the basic elements of domestic policies. Third 1 means that the North Korean policies toward the South North Korean, inter-Korean relations. And the fourth 1 means that the DPRK-US relations. In sum, I would rather, I can argue that there are basically continuities in North Korea using the basic concept in the explanation of inter-Korean relations and DPRK-US relations. On the other hand, in terms of the changes in their official statements, they are less use of the military first policy as a guiding principle. And secondly, they give very much emphasis on this improvement of standard of living of the general public when they try to explain their new policies in domestic arena. From that point of view, there are some continuities and some changes in their policies. But when we consider about the inter-Korean relations and DPRK-U.S. relations, which is directly related with the North Korea nuclear issues, there are not clear changes in adopting the basic words and the discourse to explain the current situation. That's the first questions I raised up. And my second question is about the future of six-party talks. To discuss the future of six-party talks, I would like to introduce North Korea's official statement on the issues. Foreign Minister of the DPRK issued a statement on January 10th, 2010. I quote directly, "It is our conclusion that it is necessary to pay primary attention to building the confidence between the DPRK and the United States to bring back the process for the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula on track. The conclusion of this peace treaty will help to terminate the hostile relations between the DPRK and the U.S. and positively promote the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula at a rapid tempo." There is another official statement which shows a little bit more clearly on the current position of North Korea on the six-party talks, which was issued on 17th. The joint statement calls for harmoniously settling the issues of denuclearization, normalization of relations, energy compensation, and establishment of peacekeeping regime. But they extensively argued that there were no agreement on the priority of the issues they mentioned above. And that the DPRK made efforts as keeping the discussion of denuclearization ahead of the debate on the issue of concluding a peace treaty at the six-party talks for more than 6 years. In 2008, the international community witnessed the blowing up of the cooling tower of the nuclear facility in Yongbyon. This notwithstanding, the debate on the conclusion of peace treaty failed to kick off, consequently pushing back the process of denuclearization. The practical experience proved the pushing for denuclearization in the absence of confidence is just like building a house without the foundation. As a conclusion, they argued that DPRK is not opposed to the six-party talks and has no ground whatsoever to deny them. And they added two conditions, which is kind of conditional acceptance of six-party talks. One is negotiating table for concluding a peace treaty. Second one is the removal of sanctions. Let me move over to the third questions I raised. It means that sooner or later we will have the beginning of six-party talks, but in the process of discussing the key issues in the six-party talks will face another deadlock. The reason I would like to propose is that there are clear different key definitions of key concepts of denuclearization and peace treaty, including peace regime. even though in the case of denuclearization, Korea and U.S. definition of denuclearization is rather clear, and as we discussed in the morning sessions, we would like to pursue the verifiable and irreversible approach to denuclearization. On the other hand, I mentioned briefly from the North Korean point of view, denuclearization as a first stage of discussions is in no way to accept if there is not a parallel or prior discussion of the so-called the peace treaty, including peace regime. In addition, in the case of peace treaty or peace regime, we have a very different definitions of these tricky words. From the North Korean definition of peace regime, when you look back to history of North Korean military leader Cho Myung-nok visited Washington, D.C., he argued rather strongly DPRK and U.S. should establish a kind of military commission between two powers to discuss the withdrawal of U.S. military troops in South Korea and also the dissolution of ROK-U.S. alliance. Well, it is very true, both the United States and Korea cannot accept this kind of North Korean version of peace treaty and regime. But it is almost clear when we cautiously read the current North Korean primary sources, there are not very clear changes in their way of thinking, in their argument of discourse on this key term of peace treaty and peace regime. Final questions. If then, is there a future, a final solution to solve the dilemma of nuclear issues? Reviewing the argument I discussed above, it is almost certain there will not be pretty much hope of solving the dilemma of North Korean issues in the nuclear future. Many of us have talked about efficiency of military, economic, and diplomatic approaches to solve the issues. However, there have been serious lack of understanding of nuclear issues from the view of current North Korea military first leadership. They do not consider nuclear weapons as bargaining chip for the economic, diplomatic, and even military interests. They consider nuclear weapon as the final insurance for the survival of the current military leadership, Kim Jong-il. In that perspective, we have to continue the present military efforts of six-party talks for the management of North Korea's nuclear issues. However, we must also recognize that there will be a long road to solve these issues. This time is almost up. The final words I would like to add, but in a long-term perspective, because there is a possibility of the successive leadership or the new leadership in North Korea, we have to prepare or we have to consider a kind of the co-evolution approaches of the successive North Korean leadership and also the establishment of the peace system of Korean Peninsula and Northeast Asia. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Professor Kim. It's a pleasure to be here and to share the stage with some good friends and very respected scholars. It's particularly a pleasure to be here at an event that the Gyeongnam Institute for Far Eastern Studies is doing. When I was asked to participate in this, Friday is just a really bad day for me because it's my teaching day at Georgetown, lots of committees, but I ended my seminar early to get here because the Institute for Far Eastern Studies was where I really got my start as an academic. I was a Fulbright scholar in Korea and in Japan in 1990. And Kukdong Munje Yongguso were the ones who gave me an office. It was in the basement, but still it was an office. For a grad student, it was a wonderful thing, and I got to interact with Professor Yun and all the scholars there, Ambassador Sun, and I'm forever grateful for that. I really am. And my colleague who followed me there was David Kong, professor at USC, director of the Korea Studies Institute. So both of us have very warm feelings towards Kukdong, and I'm very happy to be here. This particular topic of U.S.-Korea coordination on North Korea, the way I'm going to approach it is very simply try to answer the question of what are the factors that enhance U.S. ROK policy coordination on North Korea. Okay? And I'm going to talk about basically three, variables, if you will, or three things. The first has to do with ideas. The second has to do with biases, cognitive biases that governments or leaders may hold. And the third has to do with bureaucratic politics. Right? And I think these three factors, and I'll explain in a minute, these three factors, and whatever the grade is on each of these three factors has a very important impact on the degree of policy coordination between the United States and South Korea with regard to North Korea. The first and perhaps the most important is this whole on the issue of ideas is simply the question of what do we mean when we talk about inter-Korean reconciliation? Right? What do we mean when we talk about inter-Korean reconciliation? I think, and even more specifically, how do the objectives of inter-Korean reconciliation align with the objectives of denuclearization? Sorry. How do they align with the objectives of denuclearization? I think there basically been two views on this. One is that inter-Korean reconciliation is in and of itself about inter-Korean reconciliation, where there is no perceived threats from either side, where there truly is harmony and a meeting of minds between the two people. And this is something that can happen through economic engagement. It can happen through people-to-people exchange. It is not necessarily something that must include the nuclear issue as a prerequisite. Right? And I think people may disagree, but I think more or less elements of this particular type of definition of inter-Korean reconciliation were part of the Sunshine Policy. They were part of the Peace and Prosperity Policy of Roh Moo-hyun. The other view of inter-Korean reconciliation is the view that inter-Korean reconciliation includes all of those things, but a necessary element of reconciliation is denuclearization. In other words, you cannot have true reconciliation between the North and the South while the North still holds nuclear weapons in its hands. Right? Now, of those two views, as you can imagine, the latter view is one that is much more, that will be conducive to better U.S. ROK policy coordination. Right? When there's general agreement that inter-Korean reconciliation is something that requires denuclearization as a part of the process, you're not going to get a lot of disagreement with the United States on that particular point. And this is a very important element because any inter-Korean policy of any South Korean government will be interpreted in the United States differently depending on whether they view this particular element, denuclearization, to be an important part of reconciliation. So I would, speaking very frankly and honestly, I think during the No-Mi-Han period, the peace and prosperity policy, there were a lot of questions, and there wasn't a whole lot of confidence that inter-Korean reconciliation necessarily included denuclearization. Therefore, the peace and prosperity policy, there were lots of questions about it, like people in the U.S. weren't really sure what they understood enough about it, and it made coordination a little bit more difficult. On the other hand, the current government has been very clear in South Korea that inter-Korean reconciliation includes denuclearization. It must include denuclearization. So when Lee Myung-bak puts forward this idea of a grand bargain, which some people say, well, that sounds like sunshine policy, sounds a little bit like sunshine policy, these sorts of things, there isn't the same sort of skepticism, because they know fundamentally, right, that inter-Korean reconciliation, regardless of the language of the grand bargain, is still about denuclearization. So I think that's one very important element. Sort of the constitutive meaning of reconciliation is one very important element which either can enhance or detract from policy coordination. The second is this whole question of biases, and here in particular, personalities. Personalities do matter, right? Many of you in this room have served in government. Professor Kim has served in government most recently as National Security Advisor. Everybody is well aware personalities do matter, and they can affect the degree of coordination that takes place between two countries, like the United States and South Korea. And you can go down some of the leadership dyads over time. Professor Stuck was doing this earlier with regard to Park Chung-hee and Seung-man Rhee and YS. I mean, you look sort of Clinton and Kim Dae-jung, I think there was a leadership dyad that worked pretty well. Clinton and YS, not so well, right? Bush and Kim Dae-jung, we all know how that one went, right? Bush and No-Mi-han, I personally know how, I have very strong memories of how that one went, and Obama, MB, right? When the relationships are not that good, it does make policy coordination more difficult. And part of the reason it makes policy coordination more difficult is there's very little there is very little attention attached in each government to the high-level interaction, because they know that the two leaders don't feel that committed to each other necessarily. On the other hand, when there is a good relationship between these leaders, and they have a phone call where the U.S. president says, I promise you I'll get this done. When they know there's a good relationship, that filters out into the government, and people say, we got to get this done, right? We have to do this. So policy coordination also is greatly affected by the degree of consonance there is in the leadership between the two countries. Now, with President Lee, currently with President Lee and President Obama, it's a very good relationship. President Obama's last trip, his recent trip to Asia, he stopped in Seoul, Beijing, Tokyo, and where was APEC? Singapore. Everybody wanted to be with President Obama, rock star and everything. The one leader he really had a good personal connection with was MB Lee. When you talk to people who went on this trip, they really connected at a personal level. And that's very important, and that'll be very important for policy coordination. The one exception to this, even if there's good relations, the one exception to this are diplomatic surprises. Whether it's the 1972 North-South Joint Statement, DJ going to Pyongyang, President Clinton going to Pyongyang to get the two journalists. Whenever you have these sorts of issues, policy coordination, even when things are good, policy coordination is a little bit more challenging, right? Because everybody's afraid of leaks. And usually, even in the best of times, the ally will be informed, but it won't be that much sooner than others. It'll be sort of, at the very last minute. And I think everybody knows that. When you have these sorts of breakthroughs, often policy coordination becomes a little bit more difficult. Final point is on bureaucratic politics and policy coordination. and this is particularly with regard to the South Korean government. And again, there are others in the room and on this panel who could speak to this better than I. But when the budget for inter-Korean relations is held in the Unification Ministry, and there's a lot of dissonance in terms of how the United States and South Korea define the conditions of inter-Korean cooperation, right? When you have that concatenation of forces, policy coordination becomes much more difficult, right? Because bureaucratic politics sets in. You have a unification ministry that, let's say, for example, sees inter-Korean reconciliation as being something they must accomplish through economic engagement, so on and so forth. And the nuclear weapons stuff, that's important, but that's not a precondition, right? When you have that sort of view of inter-Korean reconciliation, and you have a ministry that has to spend its budget by the end of the fiscal year, you get a not very good dynamic, right, in terms of policy coordination, because the Unification Ministry is trying to spend its budget on inter-Korean cooperation, and the Foreign Ministry is trying to get the Unification Ministry to modulate the way it spends that money in conjunction with six-party talks. Right? That's a very difficult algorithm for policy coordination with the United States, because we can say to the Foreign Ministry, you guys, you've got to modulate this until they do X, Y, and Z on North Korea, on denuclearization. The Foreign Ministry says, all right, we're going to get that done, and they go back in their own bureaucracy and they can't get it done. Right? That's a very difficult algorithm for policy coordination. Final 2 points that I will make on six-party talks. Since Professor Ha did that, I might as well do it as well. I'm not particularly confident at this point that there are going to be any major breakthroughs in six-party talks. We had a period of more positive words between the United States and North Korea, with President Clinton's trip, Steve Bosworth's trip, the letter from President Obama to Kim Jong-il, the New Year's statement, which I think was a response basically to President Obama's letter. So we've had a lot of better, the words have gotten a little bit better. The core negotiating problem, as Professor Ha described, the core negotiating problem remains the same, which is the North may rhetorically have said they're interested in coming back to six-party talks, but substantively they want something for coming back to talks, in particular the lifting of sanctions. And I don't think that this administration in the United States or anybody in the UN Security Council right now is in the mood for lifting any sanctions on North Korea after the second nuclear test. Does this mean six-party talks is over and done with? I don't think so. Eventually, we'll get back to a negotiation. I don't know how, but we'll get back to a negotiation. But the broader and perhaps the more important point, I think many countries in the region, including the United States, including the Obama administration, understand that six-party talks, despite its flaws, are an institution that is here to stay in Northeast Asia. In no small part because it is the first and only multilateral institution in Northeast Asia that involves the five major powers. And for that reason, it will not be simply discarded if we don't have a lot of progress on six-party talk on North Korea. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Professor Chegan?
Yes. I'd like to thank the IFS and University of North Korean Studies for giving me this chance to speak today. I'm speaking from my personal capacity. My presentation has nothing to do with any official statement or position on North Korea. Actually, everybody agrees on the importance of coordination and cooperation between the two countries in handling North Korean challenges. But I think it is possible or inevitable to see the differences between the two countries, even the two allies, due to the fact that the United States tends to approach the North Korean issue from the global, regional, and the peninsula-wise, while the Korea approaches this issue from the peninsula, regional, and global. So this is kind of thinking is not unavoidable So actually, if there's differences, we can overcome by having a strategic dialogue on these issues. But actually, the reason why I try to be coordinate and cooperate with each other is like for the sake of resolving the issue. Actually, North Korea has been trying to drive a wedge between the two countries and exploit the split between the two countries, so-called Tongmi-Bongnam, tends to be favoring the North Korea. So, but about the coordination and cooperation, I like to divide the two parts. One actually already has been mentioned by Victor about this perceptual dimension of their understanding of North Korea. The second one is more specific policy coordination issues. On the first issue, I'd like to emphasize the importance of narrowing the perceptual gap between the two countries and having common understanding, or to try to narrow the gap. I think that's quite important. For example, Roh Moo-hyun and the Bush administration failed to a certain degree to narrow the gap, the understanding of the nature and the intention of North Korea, what they are doing. That's the problem, maybe more fundamental problem, but they failed, but they actually succeeded in coordinated policies. That's one of the reasons why the policy did not last long and could not bear the fruits to some extent. But actually, right now, I think we have a better or maybe a little more broader common understanding about North Korea, nature of North Korea and their intents. So, but I hope we can deepen our strategic dialogue about this nature, and also there should be a common, I hope, the understanding about the desirable end state of the Korean Peninsula. Nowadays, we tend to focus on a more specific pending issue like a North Korean nuclear issue. What about the end state of the Korean Peninsula? We barely discuss that issue at all at this stage. Of course, today, this morning, actually, this Tae-hyun Kim and the panelists raised the issue about the peaceful unification, and also Paul Chamberlain raised that issue also. I think there should be more common and strong understanding about the end state of the Korean Peninsula. I like to cover the second issue area where the policy coordination should be further developed. It seems to me that the policy coordination up to now has been driven by the issue, North Korean nuclear issue, at one point of time. It seems to me that we don't have any rather comprehensive long-term the roadmap or action plan to implement our goal on the Korean Peninsula. So it seems to me that we began with North Korean issue, but actually ends up with North Korean nuclear issue. So I don't know what kinds of rather comprehensive picture of the North Korea we have nowadays. So I think we have to expand the scope of or maybe the area of cooperation and understanding and coordination regarding the North Korean nuclear issue. Because of that, the tendency to focus on the specific issues, interagency coordination tends to be a little bit limited, sometimes stovepiped. Actually, Victor already mentioned about it, because when the Unification Ministry is leading the policy, he had difficulties in coordinating the policy between the two countries. So I hope there should be real interagency coordination among all the interagency coordination bodies, which involves all the related agencies of both countries can come together and have a very comprehensive talks on that issue. So having said that, I like to illustrate 4 areas of coordination. First is the deterrence and defense issue. We barely discussed about this issue when we discussed this North Korean nuclear issue. But actually, because North Korean nuclear challenge actually undermines the combined defense posture fundamentally. So now we are in a process to review and strengthen our combined defense posture, but we have not come to the points where we implement what we have agreed. Okay, last SCM, Security Consultative Meeting, we agreed 3 measures, the declaratory measures, but we have not come up with a concrete way to implement it. So I think we have to think about this area for coordination and cooperation. Second issue about the instability issue. Of course, I don't think the North Korea would collapse in immediate future, but actually there's a possibility. So if that's the case, we should be prepared to handle that issue. Well, of course, the issue about Plan 1529 was a quite controversial issue about 3 or 4 years ago. I think now we are in a better position to come to agreements on that issue. But what my reading about this, all the public information available right now, is more specific military response plan rather than comprehensive, because actually instability involves economic, social, political, diplomatic, as well as the military issues. But I don't think we have developed rather comprehensive a plan to deal with these all the challenges of instability. And third area is about the approach about this nuclear issue. So I don't want to cover that issue at all, because actually most suggestions have been made already. The final stage about this, like how we engage North Korea in peacetime. So since we are talking about nuclear, we tend to forget the other dimension of our North Korean policy. So while we are talking about this, the dark side of North Korean picture, but we have to think about the other way around. Finally, I'd like to shed some light on the importance of having others on board: China, Japan, and Russia. We used to have, during the Kim Dae-jung administration, we used to have a TCOB, Trilateral Coordination and Oversight Group, to implement the Paris process. I hope we can have that kinds of mechanism and also the common roadmap among the directly concerned parties to forge the basis for the stability and peace on the Korean Peninsula. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chegang. We have plenty of time for Q&A. Let me collect 2 to 3 questions at a time. And please do identify yourself and your affiliation. Yes, please.
Yeah, Chia Chen, freelance correspondent, Bethesda, Maryland. I think a very important topic absent from this forum is unification. I have a question and suggestion. Could anybody say something about what's the importance of the unification to the peace and security on the Korean Peninsula? And also, I would like to suggest second forum will be unification. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Thank you. My question, Paul Chamberlain, I'm adjunct fellow at CSIS, an independent scholar. My question is to Professor Ha. I thought I heard you say we should expect the new leader in North Korea to be more flexible. If I heard correctly, would you please explain why, since the new leader probably will have to act in a fairly inflexible way in order to consolidate his power and appease his stakeholders?
One more question. Yes, back in the room.
Earlier this morning, Jim Steinberg mentioned the reposturing, repositioning of U.S. forces and force levels south of the Han River, and I was wondering if that kind of U.S. ROC coordination can be packaged to the DPRK perception as a first step in confidence-building measures, and second, the whole issue of DPRK military-first policy seems to be antithetical to simple solutions, since without question any rapprochement must include demilitarization north of the 38th parallel, or significant military reductions up there in the north.
Does anyone wants to answer the first question?
First and third question. Okay, I think the unification is I regard the unification is the end state on the Korean Peninsula, peaceful unification. We propose our unification formula. We have the 3 steps unification formula, official. So that's the one. But actually what, in the frame of 6-party talks, what we are talking about is the peace mechanism on the Korean Peninsula. It seems that that's a rather intermediate stage. So I hope we can continue on the unification step, the efforts for the down the road. And the problem, of course, the other parties' support for the peaceful unification. If we have achieved unification, we can have a WMD free and democratic and market-oriented country on the Korean Peninsula. That would constitute the peace and stability, not only on the Korean Peninsula, but also for the Northeast Asia. About these confidence-building measures and denuclearization reduction, I think the President Lee Myung-bak proposed that the confidence-building measures and deep cuts in his speech about August 15 last year. Actually, this new initiative for the peace building and confidence is one we are going to pursue. But I don't think it is wise to include the relocation issue of USFK as a package. Once you package in that deal within the framework of 6-party talks, you have to deal with the USFK issue all the way until the last minute. So I don't think it is wise to include the relocation is as confidence-building measures set toward North Korea.
Professor Cha?
Well, on the again, I will do first and third since the second question was directed to Professor Ha. Will unification lead to lasting peace in Northeast Asia? I mean, I think the answer to that is undeniably yes. Will there be other problems with the unified Korean Peninsula in terms of relations with Japan, potential tensions with China? Sure, there would be. But to me, those things are problems and issues that the entire region will try to manage together. And I'd rather have us managing those issues and problems than a nuclear outbreak in North Korea, as we're seeing these days. On the packaging of USRK force realignment, I think the concept is an interesting one, and it would seem to make sense. I mean, if we're going to do this anyway, why don't we try to get something for it from the North Koreans? I think the problem is, while the concept is an interesting one, in practice, very few administrations, White House and particularly DOD, would ever want to allow their decisions on moving bases or force realignments to be part of a negotiation with North Korea. Historically on the Korean Peninsula, every time the United States has made big changes, whether it was the 7th Infantry Division or plans for Carter or rotating out a brigade for Iraq, these things were all done in support of U.S. military needs and with, not a whole lot of consultation even with South Korea, and then certainly not with any sort of discussion with North Korea.
Let me just say a couple of things about 1 and 3 here again. I don't think we should assume that unification of the Korean Peninsula will be more peaceful or create necessarily over the long term less tension. Certainly the process is can be a very sticky one, and it's likely to be extended over a substantial period of time. But I think once it happens, assuming it does, the relationship between Japan and China, I think, is terribly important. The old Korean saying about when whales fight, the shrimp in the middle get crushed. I think it's not clear what a united Korea would perceive its position over time and perceive its security needs over time as being. So I wouldn't assume automatically that we're all going to live happily ever after once Korea is united. As far as the negotiating of U.S. forces below the Han, I mean, so far that's been handled pretty well. But and I don't really think that it can be packaged to North Korea as long as American air power is in Korea, as long as the nuclear umbrella is over Korea, I don't think the fact that we've withdrawn below the Han is going to make all that much difference to the North Koreans. But I do think that one potential problem down the road with South Korea, which has also created some problems, is the mission of American forces in Korea. There began to be a consideration of the mission of U.S. forces in Korea during the first Bush administration, although it never really got to the surface much, although you can see hints of it in occasional public statements. But traditionally, the mission has always been to protect South Korea against North Korea and any Allied attack, whereas beginning with the end of the Cold War and the obvious superiority of South Korea over North Korea, Americans began thinking about other possible regional missions, including the possible use of American forces to protect Taiwan. And of course, that is a very sticky issue, not only in our relationship to China, but in our relationship to South Korea, because obviously that could get South Korea in a lot of trouble.
Let me respond more specifically on the question about the nature of new leadership in North Korea. Because of time limit, when I used the term co-evolution of new leadership and also the peace treaty, including peace regime, we must be aware of the term of co-evolution. It means that the new leadership will automatically much more flexibly rather than the current military-first leadership. It will be depend upon what kind of the policy coordination we will pursue to arrange to have an architecture of peaceful regime in this arena. And in addition to that, the critical question is that North Korea is now facing the real dilemma, in particular from the aspect of Kim Jong-il, whether North Korea will go toward the open and reform state without nuclear weapons, or another long march of agony with nuclear weapons. It will be very much upon the decision of the current military-first leadership, but it is also true we, the major powers of the six-party talks, should arrange the better situations for them to analyze the situation is changing in this arena. That might be giving a chance to the new leadership to analyze the current security and peace situations on the Peninsula, not from the perspective of military-first policies, but from the aspect of the open and reform policies without nuclear weapons. That's the point I mentioned when I used the term intentionally co-evolution of successive leadership and peaceful regime in this arena.
Would you like to answer the other two questions?
I add very briefly on the issues of unification. Well, it is very true that final goal of our discussions, in particular on the Korean Peninsula, is unification. But as we all recognize, the long road toward the unification is the start from the solving the dilemma of nuclear issues and confidence-building measures. And the only word I would add is that the unification issue is considerably different in comparison with the 20th century and the current 21st century. When we have another new sessions in the next year, I usually propose a kind of new type of, rather than the modern type of unifications, we should consider about much more complex and network type of unification rather than traditional modern type of unification. That's the point we could much elaborate in the next upcoming discussion.
More questions? Yes, please.
Eric McVeigh in the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis. A slightly different slant on policy coordination. I wonder if there are ROK-Japanese bilateral talks with respect to such things as the U.S. as an alliance partner, and whether the U.S. is a stabilizing force in Northeast Asia. The issue Professor Stuck just brought up about flexible forces, six-party talk positions, the U.S. dealing with China and so forth. Are there those talks?
Herbert Levin, when the Germans look back at their peaceful reunification, they say that the fact that they recognized each other with embassies in Pankao and Ban made a great contribution. Without calling them embassies, if some other term is preferred in Korean, wouldn't a good first step be to have missions in Pyongyang and Seoul for direct conversations between these two? And of course, with due respect to Mr. Steinberg earlier, the U.S. could move to Pyongyang at the same time. I do not like his concept that getting a U.S. embassy is a prize for good behavior on the part of the North Koreans. It's a mechanism for getting something done. I'm not volunteering to go. Thank you.
Let me get a question from the back of the room.
My first question is, how does Japan and its government affect peace and security? Because this seems to be the one country that wasn't discussed specifically today. And second, Professor Cha, you mentioned the six-party talks as the first and, I guess, the current multilateral fora for the issue. But I'm guessing, I'm recalled there were four-party talks, and Cato was a multilateral exercise. Were those moot to the current process? They have absolutely no influence over current policy?
We have 4 questions. One is directed to you, Professor Cha, and the 3 others are open. So, Professor Cha.
Well, let's start with the last question first. Four-party is four-party. And it, among the major powers, it only included 3 of them: the U.S., the U.S., Korea, and China. That's not 6-party or 5-party, meaning the 5 major powers of Asia. So that's one thing. In Quito, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the distinctive things about 6-party is, it involves all of the 5 countries, but it has China playing a very central role as the host of the talks. Now, we can criticize how much of a role. Sometimes they're helpful, sometimes they're not so helpful, but they're playing a role in this iteration of diplomacy that they have not played before in a much more multilateral format. Quito was largely the United States, Japan, South Korea, and the EU. And I think there was some Chinese participation, but it was always on the margins. So I think in that sense, 6-party, despite its flaws, is substantively different from anything we've seen in the past, at least in Northeast Asia. With regard to Mr. Levin's question about, or the analogy to Germany, I think many people would welcome something like that. The problem, I think, has been that the North really doesn't want it. They don't want a South Korean liaison office in North Korea. When the Clinton administration actually moved in the direction of signing an agreement to establish liaison offices in North Korea, that fell apart for a variety of reasons, but one of which was clearly a North Korean concern that there would be people getting a lot more access to their country than they would like. I wasn't here for Jim's comments earlier this morning in terms of the whole thing about rewarding bad behavior or rewarding good behavior, punishing bad behavior. That it's interesting. That language sounds a lot like the Bush administration, but I won't go there. but CVID also sounds a lot like the Bush administration, but I'm not gonna go there. But I think again, this is one of these situations where it is different from the German analogy, only because there was more interest on both sides in doing things like this than there are arguably in the Korean case. And the main problem is, as the North Koreans got into a worser and worser state from the 1980s onward, they relied more and more on internal control and blocking out the outside for regime survival. So we're now at the point where any sort of outside influence in the country is seen, outside people in the country is seen as a threat. And many of our EU friends will tell us that they have embassies there, but they're very restricted in terms of things they can do and see. So, the final thing, Eric's question on Admiral's question on Japan, ROK. These are the guys here. I mean, Chae-gang and Kim Tae-hyo when he was the deputy national security advisor, but when he was doing, these were the guys that were doing all the Japan ROK bilateral discussions, both at a track 2, track 1.5, and track 1 level. So maybe they can now tell us what you guys talked about.
Professor Chae?
Yes.
You don't have to say anything.
Yeah. Actually, for example, during the DJ administration, we had a very good information exchange program between the ROK and Japan about the rear area, the spy ship. But actually, because the cooperation was terminated due to the other issue, what I meant, the other issue. So, but under this Lee Myung-bak administration, we were able to revive some of the cooperation mechanism between the two countries. But I don't think, at this point of time, because of domestic political the configuration of Japan, is not possible to have in-depth dialogue with Japan, because actually they are preoccupied, because actually they're in transition mode right now. So, but I think we are in a better position to strengthen the bilateral relations in the security area, consultation and coordination. But I don't know the official level, but there's a kind of informal dialogue going on among the experts between the two countries. Yeah.
Please.
My name is Yun Ri. I just represent myself. I'm just concerned, Korean American, about the North Korean issue. Do any one of you really believe, under any conditions, that North Korea will really give up the nuclear forever? And I know from early 1970s we started dialogue between North and South. They have been consistently lying. Any negotiated agreement doesn't mean anything. And I know the root of communism is Plato, who really taught them communism. The lying is justified for government. And so Soviet Union consistently lied until they collapsed. And I think North Korea, in order to really give up the nuclear issues, I think they have to be collapsed. I don't think it's possible before that. And what do you think on this side of the issues?
Yeah, I want to comment.
Thank you. Hawon Lee, South Korean newspaper Joseonilbo. Japan has been called as the cornerstone of the U.S. policy in Asia by the U.S. government officials, but as we witnessed, the relations between Japan and the United States is being deteriorated recently. And Professor Victor Cha mentioned the South Korea and the United States is having a very good relation. So my question is, do you think that the relations between South Korea and United States will eventually can replace the relations between Japan and United States someday? Thank you.
Any more questions? One more question?
Henry Hetker, researcher at NARA. I wondered, the gentleman to my left wondered that, North Korea would never eliminate their nuclear weapons once they have them. Of course, China hasn't eliminated them, the Soviets haven't, et cetera, et cetera. Only a few nations have, but hardly one knows what the future will be. But if by chance the two Koreas merge and are united, and the North Koreans have those nuclear weapons, what does the South Koreans, which would probably head the new regime, would they decide to go ahead and continue to hold them, or would they eliminate them like the nations that have already done so?
We have a very interesting 3 questions.
Yeah, I'll take a crack at
Sure.
some of these. I guess the simplest answer to your first question is no. But part of that is not just an abstract no, but a sense of what the process would take in terms of what the Americans and others would have to give to North Korea to get them to do it. I just don't see as happening. But I think your point about not assuming that a united Korea would be nuclear free, I think is a very strong one. And I think it would depend a lot on the relationship with the United States, which is one of the reasons I'm so pessimistic about unification occurring anytime soon, is that China is very reluctant to accept unification under any terms, but certainly unless the United States withdraws. And yet, if the United States withdrew, a united Korea would not necessarily be any more secure than South Korea feels today, because there still would be Japan on one side and China and Russia on the other. So it wouldn't surprise me at all down the road if unification occurred that a united Korea would want to maintain nuclear weapons. Just a quick point on U.S.-Japanese relations. I wouldn't assume that U.S.-Japanese relations in any way are going to fall apart. I don't think they are. I think that we're going through a bumpy period, but I think we can easily overreact to that. And no, I don't think there is I can't conceive of a situation where Korea would replace Japan totally. I mean, its role might become bigger, but I can't see it as being an alternative alone without Japan as part of the system.
Hassan.
Let me mention very briefly on the questions of the Japanese role and also the Korea-Japan cooperation for the peace and security in East Asia. In the case of the questions whether the Korea-U.S. relations can replace the Korea-Japan relations, that kind of the argument should be transformed into the more inclusive questions rather than the exclusive questions. I would rather argue that the more positive questions we have to ask is how should we develop new architecture of peace and security in East Asia. From my point of view, at least there are 3 very much interconnected network relations. First one is how we can enhance the traditional alliance network, including the U.S., Japan, and Korea, but which not be opposed to the new emerging powers such as China. So there is another type of the very much close strategic network, of course, including China. And finally, even in the case of North Korea, we should encourage North Korea to be a part of the, in a long-term perspective, part of the network we would like to weave in that arena. If we can successfully weave 3 kind of much more complex network in East Asia, it might be the starting point for us to develop much more safe and secure way of developing the security relation in East Asia. That might be the better way for us to raise the questions on the specific role of Japan or the relations between Korea and Japan on the One is the alliance network. Second one is a strategic alliance. Final one, even we should weave the network, which includes some kind of the strange states, such as North Korea, in a long-term perspective.
Professor.
Will North Korea ever really give up its nuclear weapons? This is a hard question. I found myself asking myself that question several times in Beijing on late evenings during the negotiations. I think, in the past, it's very difficult, but in the past there may have been a chance. But the more they have consolidated their program and proven their own capabilities to the world and to themselves, the harder it gets, clearly. Does that mean if you don't think that this regime is going to give up its nuclear weapons, does that mean then you should stop negotiating with them altogether? And there, unfortunately, I don't think the answer is that you stop negotiating. Because what the negotiations do is that they do help to cap what the North is doing. And most importantly, they stop the North from doing more tests. The one thing that the United States has never been good at doing with North Korea, we've been good at deterring them from the second invasion. We've been good at rewarding them. We've been good at punishing them. We've been good at engaging them. The one thing we have never been good at is deterring missile and nuclear tests. Right? We're just not good at that. But the one way you can do that is through negotiations, because the more you deter, you can prevent them from testing again, the less and less they feel confident they have consolidated their capabilities. On Hao and Lee's question, I don't know if Korea will ever replace Japan. That's a loaded question, because does Korea really want to be what Japan was, the cornerstone? That may not be what Korea wants. I think in the end, at least the U.S. view is it's always been that these two partners are very important. And the two partners, U.S., Korea, and Japan, any policy initiative requires agreement among the U.S., Korea, and Japan, not just in Asia, but even more broadly around the world, whether it's, G20, climate change, whatever the issue may be, that these two countries are increasingly important. So I would see it more as a leveling out of the U.S. and Japan and Korea, rather than one or the other. Finally, on unification and the status of a future unified Korea, in spite of all the security concerns that Bill raised, I really find it hard to imagine a united Korea inheriting North Korean nuclear weapons and wanting to keep them. For one, if the South Koreans really wanted nuclear weapons, they could build much better ones than the ones the North Koreans are building. And secondly, I think I would say that even though I believe that they will not, we are entering a very important period in U.S.-Korea relations when it comes to nuclear issues, because the U.S.-Korea agreements, civil nuclear agreements, are due to expire, in 2014, I think is the date. And we've already seen that the Koreans now are very active in terms of civilian nuclear cooperation, deals with the UAE, India. We're entering a very important period in terms of nuclear cooperation in the U.S.-Korea alliance.
Let me collect more questions, and if there aren't, please do. Are there any questions?
I just have a two-finger.
Yes.
On the question of unified Korea, my research of Korean national security documents over a great many years is the vision is a unified Korea allied with the United States.
Which is why I'm happy. Nuclear power by North Korea. Why don't we just just isolate North Korea. I don't think Kim Jong is stupid enough to use nuclear power. That's suicidal for them. And so let them just really starve to death, and then finally they just give up, collapse. Then I think we will have solutions. That's my personal idea.
Any more questions? Well, are there any additional comments? No. Okay. Well, this completes the session 3. Thank you very much for participation, and please give a big applause.